Hello, this is another video in the church culture series. Um, it's recorded out of sequence because I've been struggling with how to say it properly. I'm going to upload it today because I want it to be in sequence or roundabouts with the other videos in that same series. So, analyzing the culture of the church like it's a culture of a country, like it's the culture of an ethnic group. Um, as opposed to a static thing, because churches are very different from each other, and someone can have a massive culture shock within the Christian church going from even, say, within a denomination in the same city. Can have a massive cultural shock because of cultural expectations. So this topic, I'm not even sure quite the very best way to label it. It has to do with pastors, and I wanted to call it pastoral culture. But I realize I can't call it that because I know nothing about pastoral culture. I've worked in churches, I've worked for churches, I've worked for pastors. Um, I've been contracted by pastors. I've known a lot of them. I've never been one, so there's an inner cultural circle that somebody else needs to talk about. For me, it is really just the topic of how do you interact with them. I know that sounds strange. But many times what happens is you enter a culture from the outside, it has a lot of relationships that are expected upon you. And if you have been trained to engage in those relationships, then it's smooth and it's natural. Then if it's difficult, it's the difference between, say, learning to parallel park one vehicle versus parallel parking another vehicle, not the difference between parking a car and piloting a submarine. They're very, very different in some cases. So, I have been in the church, in one way or another, all of my 46 years. And the church I grew up in has a background to it that's a little unusual. My parents were part of the Jesus People movement, people that came to Christ from the hippie culture. And something very interesting happened there, and I'm not sure how many times I've told this story, but what occurred is there were well-intended traditional churches that had outreaches with the intention of getting those darn hippie kids saved. And those darn hippie kids, including my parents, had questioned culture and gotten rid of many of the good and bad aspects of traditional culture, and were frequently seen in public without shoes or shirts and long, possibly unkempt hair and beards. Something peculiar happened. I want you to imagine this is a sort of a parable, if you will, of something that happened many, many times, but I'm just going to generalize into one homogeneous story. A hippie goes to an outreach in 1969, 1970. No shirts, no shoes, long hair, and they receive Jesus and are invited to come to that church the following morning. And they show up the same physical way. They've been spiritually transformed, and they've been physically left the same way they are. So they were told that they were saved and good enough to be saved, and they show up without shirts. They show up without shoes. They show up with their long hair or whatever else they got going on. Maybe a stink. And they are asked to leave, or at least come back when they can fix their appearance. And this is a very strange thing that happened that created the birth of a new church culture, and actually many church cultures in sort of a domino effect. So these people were saved and wanting to be equipped, wanting to be given foundation. And many of the churches in the area did not know what to do with them, because in their heads they hadn't thought through, yes, we're telling hippies they can be saved, but we're actually not willing to have people like that in our churches. Our congregations are not ready. And really, honestly, those outreaches may have been led by their boldest, craziest evangelists and apostles who love to see those kind of quote-unquote fringe people brought into the fold of the church, and then said to the less fringe, let's say, shepherds and teachers of the church, hey, look what we brought. And those shepherds and teachers say, yes. Are you going to get them some new clothes? So, what occurred was that rather than being founded in a specific denominational tradition, the church that I grew up in came from concern for this group of people. And it was sort of rooted and mentored by gifted equippers from other places. And so there was a brother who would come up on the weekends from the Los Angeles area, who came from a non-denominational group down there that did not use titles like pastor. Were trying to be, I don't want to say what I think they were trying to be, but they were trying to be first century church. There were also representatives of Calvary Chapel, not representatives like who's official, but people that came and got involved and were of benefit to these young believers, and people that came from the Brethren movement. And so this young church had, because larger, more mainstream churches were willing to get these people saved and not willing to have them in their churches, they grew up with a kind of hybrid theology of these groups, and never once was the word pastor used to describe anyone. They had a conviction the churches had to be led by elders, and I'm not going to make a point on either side in this video on that subject. It's not a subject worth dying for, not a sword to fall upon. It is a difference of how churches operate that has led to a certain cultural difference and difficulty for me. So I grew up in that environment and got exposed to lots of great Christian music. The Jesus People music especially. Artists like Randy Stonehill and Larry Norman and Daniel Amos and Keith Green were just part of my childhood. The Christian era of Bob Dylan is part of my childhood. There was also exposure to old hymns, both through the church I grew up in and a brief time period when my family left that church to be part of something that was attempting to be kind of, again, I don't want to put words in somebody's mouth, but they were, imagine if you could be Amish but still live in the city. People that didn't have TVs, people that had homes and electricity and cars, but didn't have TV, and really leaned heavily into very traditional old hymns and the camp songs of the 18 and 1900s, the old revival music. My interest in Christian music grew out of that, obviously, was a fairly natural progression, and I was performing in churches in my middle teens with bands that I started, with songs that I'd written, and was performing essentially focused on that as if it was going to be my career from age 15 to 27. After that, there was conviction God put on my heart to pursue some kind of Bible education, which I did. And the years that followed that, I worked in a couple of churches. I was used of God to start a church that lasted for a few years, and was a consultant in a few churches after that. And I currently believe it is simpler to follow, if I'm going to follow the convictions God has given me, to not pursue working in churches, but to be using the gifts I have, the way that I'm using them both here and in the church and in the other things that I'm doing. Whole different subject that I don't want to get too much into, but I've been inside of maybe 100 churches in the past 46 years, as a member, as a kid, as a musician, as a person that has done a variety of things in churches. And I believe the people that are born in mainline denominational churches are trained culturally to use terms like pastor. Now, once again, not taking a huge stand in this topic, but there's no verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt have leaders called pastors in your church. Thou shalt call them pastors. You can. It's not an issue to me if you do. But there's an element that arises when you enter a church and you're not accustomed to that. You are somehow on the outside because you're not using the term. Because the term is a kind of cultural code word that says that you are in. It's a little bit like the Pledge of Allegiance. You know, if you were to be the one kid in elementary school that didn't stand and put your hand on your heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance, you would be looked at as if you were declaring a specific belief system. But if you had come from somewhere else where you were not trained and had no opinion on the subject, you would not be overtly stating, I'm against this. You'd be stating, I don't know what to do, so I'm doing nothing. So I'm going to pause right here and continue this in a moment. If I have blessed you, equipped you, or encouraged you in any fashion, please like and subscribe. Thank you.